Matthew 13 is where we're going to read tonight. We have to wait a little while, huh?
It's thinking.
It's thinking. Okay, let's think.
There you are.
Okay. Some way to run a farm. That would apply. I don't know.
There you go.
Matthew 13, beginning at verse 1. That day Jesus went out of the house and was sitting by the sea, and large crowds gathered to him. So he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd was standing on the beach. And he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, the sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell beside the road. The birds came and ate them up. Others fell on the rocky places where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun had risen, they were scorched. And because they had no root, they withered away. Others fell among the thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them out. And others fell on the good soil and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. Did you know that God knows that this world and His church are full of chaff, or you might think of it as weeds? His timing may not make sense to us, but it's our place to wait for Him to do the weeding. I would, and I'm not a betting man, but I would wager that the two predominant reasons I've heard people give for not being active in church are, first of all, they say people in the church seem just as lousy as everybody else. You heard that? Or something like that? And then they'll cite some sin of which they assume they're innocent, like racism or materialism or hypocrisy, and ascribe that sin to the people of the church. And secondly, they will say something like, with so much evil and suffering in the world, belief in a good and loving God is silly. I view them as like this little lady here on their farm. You see her there. What a predicament she's gotten herself into. Here these folks will cite some evil which then is ascribed to God's ineptitude. The implication of these charges that people make against God and the church is that if we would just clean up our act, just think of all the wonderfully morally sensitive people we could get in the church. If only God would clean up God's act. From time to time, we've certainly tried to clean up both our act and God's, but we've never been quite able to pull it off, really. Throughout church history, there have been many times when we've tried to purify the church. Let's get rid of all the dead wood and pare this thing down to the really committed, the really good people, to the people who believe like me and like you. Such attempts often end up in creating a church full of people who look more like those who crucified Jesus than those who followed him. You know the old saying about the two Puritans talking to each other. One says to the other, "There's none so righteous as me and thee, and sometimes I wonder about thee." I heard about one pastor who said that he greatly admired the Mennonite churches. His comment was this. He said, "I admire their tight discipline, pacifism, and courage." And then he told the story how he once said this in Kansas, and a Mennonite pastor who happened to be at the meeting came up to him and said this. He said, "Look, we Mennonites look a lot better at a distance. We're pacifists except when it comes to fights with other Mennonites." In a way, that really describes everybody's church. Messy, untidy, only partly faithful. And then we try to defend God against the charge of moral ineptitude, which comes from those who wonder why there's so much heartache and pain and evil in the world. And if God is both loving and all-powerful, how could that be? We tried a variety of defenses. The main one goes something like this. Well, there's evil in the world because at the fall, mankind chose evil. Since the fall, God has been busy about solving the problem of evil, and doing that is a very messy endeavor. Philosophers call this theodicy, justifying the ways of God to humanity. And the problem that people have with any theodicy is that evil remains evil. The very essence of evil is that it's a mess. And you can argue that the things in our world are still in a mess. In the New Testament, Jesus tried to help us understand the mess we're in. He talked about planting a messy farm. One day Jesus told a parable which, while it may not offer a lot of help to people who question the messiness of the church and the messiness of life in general, it may be of some help to those of us who live with a mess in the church and in life and in ourselves. Let me see. How did that parable go? It was something like this. Jesus then told them this parable, this story. The kingdom of heaven is like what happened when a farmer scattered good seed in a field. But while everyone was sleeping, an enemy came and scattered weed seeds in the field, and then he left. When the plants came up and began to ripen, the farmer's servants could see the weeds. The servants came and asked, "Sir, didn't you scatter good seed in your field? Where did these weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. His servants then asked, "Do you want us to go out and pull up the weeds?" "No," he answered. "You might also pull up the wheat. Leave the weeds alone until harvest time. Then I'll tell my workers to gather the weeds and tie them up and burn them. But I'll have them store the wheat in my barn." Now, what kind of farmer is this, Is this any way to plant a garden? This parable of the wheat and the weeds is preceded by another agricultural fiasco that I read at the beginning. And now let me, I need your help to remember what I said. Did it go like this? A farmer goes out to sow seed, Jesus said, and this farmer cultivates the ground, and then he makes rows all straight, one after the other, and he prepares his furrows, and next he puts in one little seed, and then 6 inches beyond he puts in another seed, then another, and then he carefully covers them all up. Is that what he said? No, instead he said a sower went out to sow, and he just started slinging seed everywhere. Of course, some of the seed lands on the rocks. Most of the rest of the seed is gobbled up by birds. Amazingly enough, considering the sloppy method of sowing, Jesus says that some of his seed does hit good soil, and it grows. You'd think a careful farmer would cultivate the earth and be a bit more careful in the sowing, and of course today, farmers do use a lot of different methods, perhaps better methods than this method of sowing, but in Jesus' time, the sower just comes out and starts slinging seeds everywhere, falls on the earth, good places, bad places. We need to understand here that in Palestine, the fields were in long, narrow strips, and the ground between the strips was always the right-of-way. So it was used as a common path, and therefore it would be beaten almost as hard as pavement. And as the feet of the people pass by on this right-of-way, this path. And that's what Jesus means by the wayside. If seed fell there, and when you're slinging seeds in this broadcast style of sowing, some was bound to go there and fall on that place, and there was no more chance of its penetrating into the earth than if it had fallen on one of our paved roads here in town. The stony ground wasn't ground filled with stones. It was what was common in Palestine. There would be this thin layer of earth, of dirt, on top of an underlying shelf of limestone rock. The earth might be just a few inches deep before the rock was reached, and on that kind of ground, the seed would certainly germinate, and it would germinate quickly because the ground grew much warmer because of the rock being underneath of it there. The heat of the sun would cause that place to be warmer. But there was no depth of earth, and when it sent its roots down in search of nourishment and moisture, it would only meet the rock and would therefore be starved to death and quite unstable to withstand the heat of the sun and would just perish. The thorny ground also is a little deceptive. When the sower was sowing, the ground would look clean enough. It's easy to make a garden look clean just by turning it over, but in the ground still lay some fibrous roots of the couch grass and the bishop weed and all the perennial pests ready to spring to life again. And every gardener knows that the weeds grow with a speed and a strength that few good seeds can equal. And the result was that the good seed and the dormant weeds grew together, and the weeds were so strong that they throttled the life out of the seed, and it perished. The good ground, of course, deep and clean and soft, and the seed could gain an entry, and it could find nourishment, and it could grow very well, unchecked. And in good ground, he says, it brought forth an abundant harvest. Now, if that parable didn't confuse you enough, Jesus follows it up with this other story. I think it might be a parable about the same farmer, because he sows his seed in his field, but when the seed germinates and the wheat first appears, weeds also appear. I'm told that darnel looks like wheat at first, but as it matures, of course, it bears nothing. It's just a weed. Well, what happened? The farmer's servants asked. Sir, didn't you sow good seed? Why are there all these weeds coming up? And the farmer says, well, an enemy must have done this. He must have come at night, sowed weeds in this perfectly good wheat field. And you might be thinking to yourself, I think maybe the preacher's right. This is probably the same messy farmer as the other story. Enemy my eye. I've already watched this farmer working, and in the last field he planted, there were a lot of weeds and rocks and birds, and you would expect to get that kind of result when you start slinging seed in every direction. And this farmer doesn't really need any enemies sneaking around at night to ruin his harvest. He's perfectly capable of ruining it himself. Well, next the servants asked, Master, do you want us to go out and try to pull the weeds so the wheat can grow? And the farmer says, no, just let the weeds and the wheat grow together. I just love to see stuff grow. You know, it's too much trouble to go out there and weed that garden. You're going to slip up and pull some of the wheat with the weeds. So just leave it, and we'll try to sort it all out in September. Can you believe this kind of agriculture? Does it make sense? Well, of course you can, because you've watched this farmer work, slinging seeds all over in the broadcast way, and as it turns out, he's not much better at hoeing than he is at sowing. He just says, let them all grow together and we'll worry about it later. Now, to be fair, I understand that in Palestine there were two ways of sowing seed. It could be sown by the sower scattering it broadcast, like it says he did as he walked up and down the field. Of course, if the wind was blowing, in that case of particularly a high wind, if the seed was not a real heavy seed, it would be caught by the wind and blown into all kinds of places, and sometimes very far out of the field. The second way might be considered a lazy way, but it was another method that was quite common in those days, and it was to put a sack of seed on the back of a donkey and tear or cut a hole in the corner of the sack, and then to walk the animal up and down the field while the seed ran out, which I guess in some ways you could consider that closer to how we do it today, except we use a tractor and a machine that puts the seed in the ground. For us today, this is a kind of a surprising story, and something you may have never considered, but it's particularly surprising to hear a story like this in Matthew, the book of Matthew. You see, Matthew isn't a gospel of permissiveness. It's a gospel of judgment. There's never any permissive little pat on the head in Matthew. His gospel is full of stories about judgment, about separation of good trees from those that don't produce fruit. He lists the perils of building a house on sand as opposed to building a house on rock. He talks about choosing God or mammon, entering the narrow gate, sorting out the goats and the sheep, and not throwing pearls before swine. In Matthew, we meet Jesus for the first time through the words of John the Baptist in Matthew 3:12, where he says, his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will thoroughly clear his threshing floor. And he will gather his wheat into the barn, but he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. Separate, purify, purge. That's kind of what we hear from Matthew. The frustrating thing is that in Matthew's gospel, we're also told about a marriage feast where servants are sent out to invite to the feast as many as you find, both bad and good. It was Matthew who told the story about fishermen who have a great dragnet, and when they pull it to shore, tied between two boats, they dragged in fish of every kind. Master, do you want us to make an invitation list based on the New York Social Register? You know? No, just send an invitation to everybody who's listed in the Manhattan telephone book, he says. Master, you want us to just fish for tuna this time? No, stingrays and $10 taste good too. Just fish for everything. What kind of a way is this to run a party? And what kind of a way is that to fish? I believe that these parables speak directly to the messiness of the church. The messiness resulting from a Lord who says to his church in Matthew 28, go make disciples of all the nations. And in Matthew 24, go preach this gospel throughout the whole world, he says. I guarantee you, if you do that kind of thing, you'll be surprised at who shows up for baptism. You know, the church cast its dragnet across the whole world, and look at some of the creatures we caught here tonight. You know, the invitation to the party was issued, and look who showed up. Somebody would look at us and say, what a mess. However, number two, let's own the messy farm. I think the story says it's God's mess. Because when this God starts sowing or inviting or blessing or calling, this God just doesn't know when to stop. Doesn't know where to stop. And it's not for us to judge which seed will take root, which tree will bear fruit. It's not for us to distinguish between the wheats and the weeds. That's God's business. That's for him to determine. I expect that when Jesus told this story, this parable also spoke to a larger issue, the larger issue of the messiness, not just of the church, but of the world. If you think it's a mess in the church, then just look over at Paris today. It's a mess in the world. If this is God's world, then many would say that we should expect God to have done a better job of making it seem more like God's word. Here we have war, we have injustice, we have pain, we have suffering, we have sickness. You know, you can make your own list, and I think that's the concern caught up in the servant's query to the master here. Lord, did you not sow good seed in your field? Lord, on that early morning of creation, when you looked at your world and you said, that's good and that's real good, were you talking about this world? So why are there weeds? Why the chaff? Well, the enemy slipped in at midnight and he probably sowed these weeds among the wheat. Who's the enemy? When we hear the term enemy as Christians, we immediately think of Satan, right? And that's possible. That really makes sense to us, that this enemy he's talking about is Satan. But let me ask you this question. When Adam and Eve ate that forbidden fruit in the garden, are they the ones who initiated evil in the world? You might argue, well, God put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden in the first place, and he told them not to eat from it, so it's really God's fault. And Adam can say, well, Eve gave me the fruit, it's her fault. And Eve can say, the serpent tempted me, it's his fault. How like us to try to pin evil, particularly the evil we do, on somebody else. The devil made me do it. I think that this is a parable which struggles with the problem of evil. There certainly is some supernatural force set loose in the world, sneaking around at night, making mischief. There is a Satan who roves about in the darkness, working his mischief, trying to devour God's creation. Amen?
Amen.
If we don't believe in Satan, we don't believe in the Bible, because he's mentioned a lot there. One thing we know is that evil is real. It's here. Just flip on your TV tonight and look at what they're talking about in Paris. Evil is real. The world is a mess. There's bad seed growing right alongside the good seed. Weeds germinate just as well as wheat does. And often you can't tell the weeds from the wheat. At least not until they're full grown. And then it's too late to do a whole lot about it. Out of this mess came the ancient biblical cry in Psalm 94, verse 3. How long shall the wicked, O Lord, how long shall the wicked exult? And we look at these weeds and this wheat, and that's our question. How long, Lord? Or how about the words of the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 12:1? Righteous are you, O Lord, that I would plead my case with you. Indeed, I would discuss matters of justice with you. Why has the way of the wicked prospered? Why are all those who deal in treachery at ease? And of course, this is serious stuff, and it's no joking matter when it's your life, and evil sometimes flourishes and goodness withers. And it's not funny when cancerous cells spread throughout the body and good cells starve, or when defenseless students stand before tanks in Beijing and are crushed, or when drugs destroy our youth and encourage those who sell them, or when you're sitting in a theater or at an outdoor cafe and somebody comes along and shoots you. At such times, we have to ask, Lord, did you not sow good seed in your field? It's a mystery, and even by the end of the parable, it remains a mystery. By the end of the parable, there are still weeds just growing right alongside the wheat, and you wonder what's going to happen. We don't know yet. We've got to wait. We've got to wait until the harvest, according to the story. What do you think? Is the farmer employing a good strategy? Or is the farmer taking a big risk? Is he headed for a tough harvest, putting a lot of good wheat at risk with this idea? You want us to gather up the weeds, the servants asked. No, let's just wait. Let's just wait. I'll risk it, he says. Well, what kind of a way is that to run a farm? So let's talk about tending this messy farm. Well, the farmer says, I don't only do sowing, I'm also into animal husbandry. I remember one time I had this one sheep that was lost. Just one sheep. It had 100, but one of them got lost. I took a risk and I left the 99 sheep in the wilderness, and I went out after that one sheep, and I searched until I found the one sheep. Last year I gave this dinner party, and I told my servants to bring in everybody off the streets. Anybody that they could lay their hands on, both good and bad. It was kind of rough on the furniture, but we had a great party. And then I had these grapes to harvest, and I went out and I saw that I needed more people to harvest them. So I went downtown and I got more people, and then I went downtown again to get more. And by the end of the day, I was feeling so good, I said, heck, I'll just pay everybody the same wage, even those who've only been here for an hour. But the workers grumbled, so I said, hey, this is my farm, isn't it? And I'm going to run my farm the way I run my farm, okay? You can read about that in Matthew. It takes patience to work on a farm like that. That takes patience to endure such a weight and such a risk. Somebody once said, nothing is perfect. Life is messy. Relationships are complex. Outcomes are uncertain. And I really like this last one. People are irrational. I think that's pretty much Jesus' point in these parables. The world isn't full of saintly people who make all the right choices, who are absolutely perfect in every way. It's full of sinners who always make mistakes, and evil is lurking to help us make even more mistakes. And he also points out that there's a harvest. It could be like a great banquet. It could be a great feast, or it could be a devastating fire. You get to choose. You can go to the banquet or you can go to the fire. It's God's farm, and farming God's way is messy. A man named David Slagle from Decatur, Georgia, told this story, and to me, I think it fits with Jesus' parables about this messy farm. Here's what David said. He said, I love ribs. I tend to identify with it. I love ribs, so when I heard about a restaurant that had amazing ribs, a bunch of my friends and I drove 50 miles to get there. The place was packed and the food was great. It was an all-you-can-eat rib night, and the rib bones were piling up as fast as the line to get in. Eating ribs is messy business. Or to be some amens there. If you do it right, it's messy. Barbecue sauce gets on your face, your fingers, your clothes. Dirty napkins pile up next to half-eaten bowls of baked beans and coleslaw. When our crew had eaten all we could, we paid our tab and waddled out to our car. I reached into my pocket for my keys and came up with nothing but lint. Panicking, I looked through the window at the ignition. I hoped that I'd locked my keys in the car because in the back of my mind a more disgusting possibility was taking shape. When I saw that the ignition was empty, I knew exactly where my keys were to my car, my house, and my office. Only seconds earlier, those precious keys had slid off my tray and followed a half-eaten corn cob and many bones to the bottom of a trash can. I'd thrown away my keys on the all-you-can-eat rib night, which is why I never put my keys on my tray. He says, my friends weren't going to do the dirty work for me, so I dove into the dumpster, fishing through bones, beans, barbecue, corn, cake, coleslaw, and a host of saliva-soaked napkins. A shiny layer of trash can slime coated my arms before I finally grabbed those precious keys. As I meditate on the incarnation of my Savior, Jesus Christ, I think about our dumpster diving God. I mean no disrespect by calling him that. On the contrary, I have a soaring adoration for the infinite God who left a pristine, sinless heaven to search through the filth and rubbish of this fallen world for something precious to him, me. Life is messy. Amen? Relationships are messy. Church is messy. If you want it nice and pristine, you're in the wrong place. Because God doesn't do church that way. He does messy church, I think. Listen to these words from Revelation 7 to hear when everything's going to get cleaned up. Revelation 7, verse 13. Then one of the elders answered, saying to me, these who are clothed in the white robes, who are they? And where have they come from? I said to him, my Lord, you know. And he said to me, these are the ones who came out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason they are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will spread his tabernacle over them. They will hunger no more, nor thirst any more, nor will the sun beat down on them, nor any heat. For the Lamb in the center of the throne will be their shepherd, will guide them to springs of water of life. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. You ready for harvest time?
Amen.
This is the time when God will take care of the mess. He's going to clean it up. But here, just because of sin, it's going to be messy. It's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. And people are going to look at the mess and say, well, that just proves there's no God. But to me, it proves there is a God, because he's willing to wade through us what we've created because he loves us, so that he can get us to this point in heaven where we can be all cleaned up and all straightened up and wonderful and blessed. Are you there yet? You need the Lord. Tonight would be a good time to come to him. Just come forward and sit on the front row, and after we get done singing, bringing in the sheaves, I'll lead you in a prayer. But let's all of us stand and praise God for our messy world and our messy lives. Ask him to help us with the mess, especially the weed part, the evil part, the sin part, so that we can get closer to that time in heaven when everything's going to be all cleaned up and everything's going to be beautiful and wonderful in heaven with him. Let's stand together and commit to him as we sing.